Before we begin the Yville curriculum, we're going to go over some basics of vaccine science. Now, this is not meant to be comprehensive. I'm going to be oversimplifying a lot. However, there is a lot more detail in the PowerPoint itself than what I'm going to discuss. So if you'd like to include that in your lesson plans, it's available to you. We're going to be going over pathogens and antigens, the adaptive immune response, how vaccines initiate that immune response, and some different types of vaccines. Pathogens and antigens are important terms to understand when discussing vaccine science. So a pathogen is just anything that causes a disease in your body. So this can be bacteria, viruses, parasites, and so on. Antigens, on the other hand, are a little bit more complicated. This is going to be the part of the pathogen that your body recognizes in order to destroy it. So in our bacteria example here, we actually have multiple antigens. These little hairs on the bacteria called pili can be an antigen. This long tail called the flagellum can be an antigen. And the cell wall as a whole can also be an antigen. Here we have COVID-19, and the famous spike protein is going to be the antigen that your body recognizes. Now, antigens don't have to be specific to a pathogen. For example, your red blood cells contain antigens. That's the blood types like A and B. If you have blood type A, that means you have an A antigen that is recognized by your white blood cells, and that's how your white blood cells determine that that's your blood. And the same principles apply to organs as well. There are two different types of immunity. There is innate and adaptive. Innate immunity is not specific towards any pathogen. It can be just a barrier between you and the outside world, like your skin. It also includes some generalist white blood cells, such as neutrophils, that aren't specific to any one pathogen, but rather a broad range of them. The adaptive immune response is what we're going to spend more time talking about. The adaptive immune response is specific to a pathogen that infects the body. This is the adaptive immune response. Again, I'm going to be simplifying. However, the figures provide more detail, and in addition to that, I have sources located at the bottom here. It all begins with detection. So the initial infection will be caught by a white blood cell. That white blood cell will break the pathogen down and then actually present an antigen to a different type of white blood cell. That whole process will stimulate antibody production. So antibodies will start to be made. These antibodies will be very important in flagging and destroying a particular pathogen. So the response begins, and antibodies will flag certain pathogens for destruction. In addition to that, many cells of your own body may be infected by the pathogen, and different types of white blood cells called killer T cells will destroy infected cells. And finally, we have the memory portion of the adaptive immune response. And this is important when it comes to vaccine science because these white blood cells are going to be ready to produce antibodies that are tailor-made towards that particular pathogen. So, vaccines are meant to jumpstart this adaptive immune process by introducing a non-pathogenic antigen to the body. It is meant to imitate the infection without actually giving it to you. They almost never cause illnesses, although they can cause symptoms. The entire process is going to end with those memory cells ready to go so that if you were actually infected by that particular pathogen, your body already has the antibodies necessary to destroy them. These are some different types of vaccines. Now, there are many different types of vaccines that are not listed here. However, I chose ones that are either the most common or commonly discussed currently with the COVID-19 pandemic. The first kind is live attenuated vaccines. These are a weakened form of the pathogen, so they are not strong enough to cause an actual infection, but they can still kickstart the adaptive immune response in a very similar fashion. Now, subunit and conjugate vaccines are vaccines that introduce a part of the pathogen or an antigen that can be still detected by your immune system and initiate that adaptive immune response. Inactivated vaccines are killed or inactivated pathogens that are introduced in the body and kickstart the adaptive immune response much in a similar way as the previous ones. Toxoid vaccines are very interesting. Botulism is a good example of this. It's not that the pathogen itself causes the disease, but rather the toxins that it releases. So these toxoid vaccines actually contain inactivated forms of the toxin that your immune system can recognize and create antibodies against to break down. Very interesting there. mRNA vaccines are next, and these are very popular and relatively new, although the science behind them has been years in the making. And the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines are examples of mRNA vaccines. They're going to introduce mRNA wrapped in a little fatty sphere that your cells will take in and actually translate into a part of a pathogen, the antigen, that can be recognized by your immune system. This is great if you happen to be a high school teacher and you want to think of a good way to talk about the central dogma. mRNA and DNA vaccines are great subjects to discuss. DNA vaccines are going to be similar to mRNA vaccines. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine is an example of the DNA vaccine. It's actually going to contain an adenovirus, which will have a plasmid, that's a section of DNA, that will go inside of your cells, and your cells will take in that DNA and transcribe it into mRNA, and then translate it into a particular protein or an antigen that can be recognized by your adaptive immune system. These are some references here. Feel free to take a look at those, and thank you so much for listening.